from the University of Southampton, and first of all, thanks to Hugh Jarvis and tsolacademic.org for inviting me to give this talk. I'll be talking to you for about half an hour about the phenomenon of English as a lingua franca and about the implications of shifting from an EFL, English as a foreign language, to an ELF approach, or ELF as it's usually called for short, and as I'll be calling it during my talk. It's very difficult to believe that in 2010 we've just held the third annual International ELF conference. That was in Vienna. We have the fourth one coming up in Hong Kong next year, and the fifth one for 2012 is already being planned. And the proceedings of the first ELF conference, edited by Anna Marin and Eleanor Ranta, were published in 2009. ELF Studies and Findings, and the proceedings of the second ELF conference are now in press. Even more surprising is that there is already an ELF journal, the International Journal of English as a Lingua Franca, which is going to be launched in 2011 by a major European publisher, with Barbara Seidelhofer, Anna Marin and myself as co-editors. And of course, there are now hundreds and possibly thousands of PhD students researching ELF around the world, and many, many ELF corpora and publications. And all this has happened very quickly. During the past 20 years, ELF has gone from being completely obscure, pretty well nobody had heard of it, to now a widely known phenomenon and a serious object of academic study. But this speed of its development has led to problems. As I'm sure you're aware, change, and especially language change, is always regarded with suspicion, and ELF is no exception to this. So it's not surprising that ELF has become very controversial. And ELF is particularly unsettling for teachers who prefer clear rules and therefore have a preference at the moment for English as a foreign language, which in effect provides the rules of native English. And many people, both native and non-native English speakers, who prefer one single standard English, usually British or American, that is, they have a monolithic approach, they see ELF as having far too much variation. While at the opposite extreme, some World English scholars, having had their battles for the acceptance of the post-colonial Englishes, for example, Indian English, Singapore English, and they take a pluralistic approach to English, they see ELF as not having enough variation and as some kind of attempt to impose a single variety of English on everyone, and I'll be coming back to these issues later. But first, a little bit of personal information. I began researching ELF a long time ago. It was when I began my PhD in 1989, and as far as I know, it was the first PhD in ELF, though ELF was then known as English as an International Language, or EIL. One of the main reasons I got interested in ELF was that I'd been an EFL teacher and teacher trainer for many years, and I'd become intrigued by how well EFL students from different first language backgrounds understood each other a lot of the time, but that on the other hand, sometimes they didn't understand each other. And I had a hunch that accent was heavily involved in this variation. So I started a PhD to investigate this. And though I now don't agree with many of the things that I thought back then, and I wouldn't now say many of the things I said in my PhD thesis, or even in my 2000 book that developed out of that thesis, my early work was probably the beginning of research into ELF as we now know it. But a very important point is that we've had a vast increase of information from more recent research, and obviously we all have to alter our own ideas in line with new evidence as it becomes available. The main focus of my own PhD research was actually on accommodation among non-native English speakers. Accommodation, for anyone who doesn't know, is how people adjust their language to make it more like the language of their conversation partners. They do this to be liked by them or to be better understood by them, or both. But as part of that research, I also identified certain pronunciation features that caused intelligibility problem in communication among non-native English speakers, and also other features In fact, the majority of pronunciation features that are still taught to learners of English that didn't actually cause problems when non-native speakers of English were talking with other non-native speakers of English. And out of this came what I call the Lingua Franca core, a set of features that seem to be necessary for intelligibility a lot of the time when English is spoken as a lingua franca. I published a very detailed account of the Lingua Franca core in 2000 in my book, The Phonology of English as an International Language. As I say, English as an international language has subsequently become called English as a lingua franca. The book caused a lot of controversy at the time. People who believed standard native English should be spoken by all non-native English speakers said the Lingua Franca core was promoting pronunciation errors and anything goes, while people who believe in a world English's pluralistic approach said the Lingua Franca core was trying to replace one monolithic set of rules with another. And they all seem to miss the point that the Lingua Franca core was simply describing what I found in my data. But before I go on and say more about my pronunciation research and other ELF research, I'd better actually define ELF. And one useful definition that I often use, in fact it's the one I mostly use, comes from the Voice website. I'll explain Voice in a minute, the Vienna-Oxford International Corpus of English. And their definition is that ELF is an additionally acquired language system which serves as a common means of communication for speakers of different first languages. This is sometimes, but very wrongly, interpreted to mean that native English speakers are excluded from ELF communication. They're not, because ELF is not the same as English as a native language, so it's additionally acquired for native speakers of English too. Though because there are so many more non-native English speakers than native English speakers, in practice ELF is often used without any native English speakers present in the interaction. So ELF is seen as different from other languages that people learn as foreign languages, including EFL, as it's not used primarily in communication with native speakers, but with other non-native speakers. This means that the goal of ELF isn't to approximate a native speaker's English, which would be the goal of traditional EFL, and therefore it means that differences from native English can't automatically be assumed to be errors in ELF, as they would be in EFL. Similarly, in an ELF approach, code switching, the switching out of the language, out of English, into another language, maybe the speaker's first language, maybe another language they know, code switching isn't automatically seen as a weakness in ELF. It's not necessarily, and it's often not, the case that a speaker is using some other language because they simply don't know the English term because of a gap in their lexical knowledge. ELF research has shown that code switching is often a pragmatic strategy that speakers use to enhance the communication. They know the English word or words, but they choose to use something else to project their identity, to promote solidarity with the group that they're speaking with, or whatever. And Alessia Kogo has published a lot of work on this. I better also say that ELF shouldn't be confused with the rather strange phenomenon you might have heard of called Globish. That's a kind of English that's been completely invented by someone called Jean-Paul Nerrière, and it's a simplified, reduced English based on his own intuitions about how non-native speakers speak English with each other. It's had a lot of publicity recently, but it really does belong in the world of fairy tales, as it bears no relationship with reality, and unlike ELF, it has no empirical support at all. But back to the real world. Over the past 10 years, ELF research has focused mainly on speech, and the first research, such as my pronunciation research, tended to explore surface linguistic features in ELF speech, whereas the later research has got more interested in the pragmatic skills and strategies that underlie these features. Having said that, accommodation, which is now emerging as one of the most important of these skills and strategies, as I've already mentioned, was something I identified in my earliest research. though people often don't realise that there's a whole chapter on accommodation, phonological accommodation, in my 2000 book. And even though there's now more interest in the skills and strategies underlying ELF features, there are good reasons to still take notice of the earlier descriptive work that identified the features. For example, the forms themselves are primary empirical evidence that we can use for the study of ELF pragmatics. The existence of these kinds of features in the speech of skilled ELF speakers, people who know the English as a native language rules but choose not to use them, the existence of these features in their speech demonstrates that ELF isn't just some kind of deficient learner English used by speakers who don't know native English rules. And the features are themselves likely to be evidence of language change in progress. As we know, language change happens very slowly. It starts off in certain linguistic environments and in certain social groupings, and it gradually spreads outwards. So even if at the moment there are only in some corpora a small number of certain ELF features, that doesn't mean that ELF is not happening. It's just that it's happening slowly. And these sorts of features are indications of the changes that are in progress. So what kinds of features am I talking about? And I'll start with pronunciation, as that's my own first area of research. And in my early research, I found that English speakers from a wide range of first languages regularly substitute the th and the of native English with a t and a d, or a s and a z. And that they use either a vocalized L, oo, or a clear L, where native English speakers often use dark L, oo, so that, for example, bill could be bill or bill. And in none of these cases is there any intelligibility problem. I also found a small number of pronunciation features that did seem to be crucial a lot of the time for phonological intelligibility among non-native speakers of English, and these included most of the consonant sounds, initial consonant clusters and some word medial consonant clusters, vowel length distinctions such as I and E, and nuclear, or as it's often known, tonic stress. But apart from these, the other features of native English pronunciation seemed often not to be needed, and actually seemed sometimes to reduce mutual intelligibility in ELF. And I'm thinking of features such as weak forms, the t, the f, the from instead of to, for, from, elision, leaving sounds out, assimilation, changing sounds, and pitch direction, and also stress timing. In fact, there's plenty of research showing that it's native English speakers who use all these features, and not non-native English speakers that have unintelligible pronunciation in ELF communication. Soon after the pronunciation research was published, an article by Barbara Seidelhofer appeared in International Journal of Applied Linguistics. This was December 2001. And this article, that often quoted article, was the first that called for a description of ELF. And in the same article, Seidelhofer announced the launch of the voice corpus, which was going to be the first corpus providing a description of ELF. The Vienna-Oxford International Corpus of English is based in Vienna. Barbara Seidelhofer is the director of the corpus. She runs a large team there, and it's now available online for free access by anyone who wants to have a look. Following that article, researchers started to investigate particularly ELF lexis and grammar, and a number of features were identified that seem to be common to a lot of ELF speakers from different first languages, and I'll just give you a few examples of these. There's the non-marking of third-person singular S in the present tense. For example, she think, instead of what is often the native speaker English form, she thinks. The countable use of nouns, where many native speakers of English would use uncountable. For example, evidences, advices, softwares. The use of the relative pronoun who, where a native speaker of English would probably use which. For example, the paper who will be published. And the use of an all-purpose question tag, such as isn't it, or is it, he's coming today, isn't it, or he's coming today, no, or he's coming today, is it? As far as lexis goes, the elf corpora have identified new collocations such as space-time, where a native speaker of English would say spare time, serious criminal, where actually I'm not quite sure what a native speaker would say, maybe hardened criminal. The corpora have also found innovative uses of morphemes. For example, from the adjective boring comes the elf noun boringdom. Actually, as far as I know, there isn't a noun for this in native English, so this elf innovation has actually filled a gap in native English. For more on all of this, you can see especially the publications by Barbara Seidelhofer and the Voice team, and also Martin Dewey, who I think wrote the first PhD thesis on elf lexicogrammar that he finished in 2007. Soon after that, Anna Marinen, who was then at Tampere University in Finland and is now at Helsinki, launched the ELFA corpus, the English as a Lingua Franca in Academic Settings corpus, and that led to a lot of investigation of features of academic ELF. For example, one thing that they found is that the progressive aspect is used in stative verbs where a native English academic would probably use a simple form. For example, and this is a direct quote from the corpus, "This comes to the point I've just been mentioning," whereas a native speaker would probably say, "I've just mentioned." As with the lexicogrammatical findings from general settings, the ELFA research demonstrates how such features are used systematically and exploit the possibilities of the English language that native English speakers, at least at present, don't exploit. The findings also demonstrate how ELF features often involve processes of regularisation that are very similar to those that occur in native English. For example, in native English, you have changes from uncountable to countable nouns. We talk about coffees and beers and accommodations, where they used to be uncountable. But because ELF is in a situation of accelerated language contact, it seems to be leading to accelerated language change. In other words, non-native English speakers are innovating a lot faster than native English speakers. And because of the diversity of their first language backgrounds, there's also a lot more hybridity emerging in their English than emerges in changes in native English. But the problem is that there's still this feeling among many people, both native and non-native English speakers, that it's the natives who somehow own English, and that any innovations must first be sanctioned by native speakers before non-native speakers are allowed to use them without being told that they're making errors. As I mentioned earlier, attention in ELF research has turned more recently to pragmatics, and especially to accommodation and code switching and other pragmatic strategies, and I mentioned the work of Alessia Kogo, and also to issues relating to intercultural communication, and here I can mention the work of Will Baker and an article he published in TESOL Quarterly in 2009. And all this kind of research has demonstrated how ELF speakers use a range of online processes in determining which forms to use in any given interaction. And this finding initially led to something of a dilemma in ELF research, because on the one hand, some kind of codification is needed in respect of the description of the regularities in ELF that are being identified in all the research. But on the other hand, this doesn't deny the fluidity of ELF. That means that its users are exploiting the potential of English for their own purposes in the context of the specific conversation, rather than simply reproducing the forms of English they were taught in school. So the problem is that because of the fluidity of ELF, it can't be called a variety in the traditional sense of the term, and nor can its speakers be called a speech community in the traditional sense. In these days of massive intercultural communication, of which, of course, ELF is the prime example, the idea of bounded speech communities is out of date. As Seidelhofer and others have pointed out, a much more relevant way of talking about it is Wenger's notion of a community of practice. In other words, a group of people who have mutual engagement in shared practices, who take part in jointly negotiated enterprise and who make use of a shared repertoire when they do so. People who find the notion of elf difficult to grasp seem to be unable to see beyond traditional orientations to language and to assume that there can still, in the 21st century, be only two possibilities. Either a language has to be relatively fixed, so that it can be more or less fully codified in grammars and dictionaries, or, if you can't do that, it's a case of anything goes. It has no standards at all. But elf is completely different. It isn't that it's too variable to be a variety, it's that its variability is one of its main characteristics, as Firth has pointed out. And it's the notion of language variety itself that's the thing that needs to change, so that it can reflect the way people use lingua francas, and especially elf, in today's world. And this means accepting that as far as intercultural communication in elf is concerned, a skilled user is no longer someone who's mastered the forms of standard British English or standard American English, but it's someone who's acquired the skills that they need to adapt their English in line with the demands of the current interaction, as I talked about before, for the purposes, to exploit the purposes of English for their own purposes in the context. This will involve using forms that may be very different from those of native English, and the forms may vary from interaction to interaction. And one final point about elf research. Up to now, a lot of what's been published has focused on elf in Europe, but in the past 2 or 3 years there's been a huge growth of interest in elf in East Asia and Southeast Asia, probably because that region has very large numbers of elf users who often use elf within the region itself, among themselves. And since 2009 there's been an East Asian corpus, the ASEAN elf corpus, led by a team, led by Andy Kirkpatrick, who has a team, and this corpus has links with voice. They've been collecting data in that region now for around a year. And in late 2010, I think we'll be seeing the first entire book dedicated to elf in East Asia, and it's Andy Kirkpatrick's book, English as a Lingua Franca in ASEAN, which explores elf use across all the members of ASEAN Plus 3. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the Plus 3 are 3 other countries, China, Japan and Korea. And in this book, as well as describing the kinds of English used, Kirkpatrick considers the broad implications for English teaching. And I'm going to move on now and say something about teaching myself. As I mentioned earlier, all this talk about elf has been very unsettling for English teachers, who've asked what it means for them and what they can do in their classrooms. But probably very irritatingly for teachers, elf researchers, myself included, have argued that it's not our place to tell teachers what to do, what they should teach, and have said that teachers need to decide what to take from the research and to sort of translate it into their practices in their local environments. And 10 years after the first detailed elf research was published, one teacher has done this for pronunciation. This is Robin Walker, whose book, Teaching the Pronunciation of Elf, will be published in August 2010, and explores how teachers can incorporate the findings of elf pronunciation research, and especially the Lingua Franca core, into their pronunciation teaching in their own particular area where they teach. But apart from that, there still isn't anything that goes into major details about teaching, and I suspect that this is mainly because of the situation with English language testing. After all, teachers have to teach what's tested, and learners have to learn what they're going to be tested on. So while the large exam boards continue to test English learners in relation to native English, teachers feel they have to teach this English and learners want to learn it. The learners then go out into the world and find that the English they learnt in the classroom isn't the English they use as a lingua franca mostly in the real world. As Eleanor Ranta has pointed out in an article in the International Journal of Applied Linguistics, again, Volume 20, Issue number 2, July 2010, and she calls her article English in the Real World versus English at School. And in the article she explores how English is taught in Finland and then how very differently it's used in real life by Finnish people. So what can I say about the implications of an ELF approach as opposed to an EFL approach? Well, as I see them from the perspective of a researcher, there are maybe four things I'd like to say. Firstly, that English as a native language isn't necessarily relevant for ELF communication, and it may be totally irrelevant. So there needs to be a re-evaluation in English language teaching of the notion of error as far as ELF is concerned. Secondly, that ELF teaching should somehow develop in learners the fluidity and the flexibility they need in order to be effective in ELF communication. For example, as I've mentioned, the ability to accommodate appropriately, the ability to code switch effectively. And at the receptive level, I think ELF teaching needs to deal with the vast diversity of the first language backgrounds of ELF speakers that the students may later meet when they go out into the real world. And above all, I think that language awareness is the key to successful ELF use, rather than the continued focus on some sort of predetermined concepts of correctness, especially correctness according to native speaker English norms. But as far as the specific details of all these implications are concerned, I go back to what I said, that it's for the teaching professionals themselves and not for people like me to decide whether and how to implement ELF in their classrooms. And on a completely different note, but I think one that's very important, if native English speakers want to be successful participants in ELF communication, I think they'll have to accept all the evidence that shows that they're often not very effective, and they need to do something about it, instead of assuming that everyone else should make all the effort to adjust and everyone else is really the non-native English-speaking majority. As I pointed out at the very start of my talk, ELF has been rather controversial, and it still is. And as I said, there seem to be various reasons for this, such as people don't like change, they particularly don't like language change. A lot of people have invested a lot of time and effort in either teaching or learning native-like English, or both, and they see ELF as a bit of a threat to the investment that they've put in. Some people even misunderstand what ELF researchers are saying, so they think that ELF is some kind of attempt to impose a new kind of English on the world. And many seem to be unaware that the claims made by ELF researchers are based on sociolinguistic evidence, not on their personal opinion, and that the point of ELF is to offer a new choice, not to restrict anything to learners. And I suspect that all these kinds of reactions are going to continue for some time to come. And there's even a small group of people who seem to criticise ELF in everything they say and write. Even one person who seems to read everything, absolutely everything that I publish in journals, and then write a negative response to it in the same journal if the editor will let him. It's a bit like having a stalker, only this is an academic stalker. I won't say who it is, but I expect he'll write a response to this talk, and then maybe you'll find out. But I'd like to end on a very positive note, because despite all the controversy, the doubt, even the downright nastiness from some people, ELF research really has achieved what 20 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, nobody, myself included, could have believed would be possible. It's turned ELF into a fully established research paradigm with its own conferences, journal, academic research groups, and masses of PhD students, and made it one of the major topics in English language, and one that's discussed all around the world. So I hope you'll continue the discussion wherever you are, and thanks for listening.